Hello, everyone. Today we're going to discuss a very common science question. And the question is something like that, all right? Now, if you look at the diagram, and the question says Joe placed a container of water at 70 degrees Celsius on a tabletop in a room, and the container has a lid on. After some time, he noticed water droplets forming on the lid. On which side of the lid, inner or outer, were the water droplets observed? Explain your answer. Now, this is really a very typical question relating to the science concept that on the states of water. Remember, in the science concept of states of water, we learned about the different processes of how water changes state. All right, and if you recall, what are some of the processes? Things like evaporation, all right, where water change state from liquid to gaseous state. And then we also learn the reverse of evaporation, which is condensation. All right, condensation is the reverse. It is when water in the gaseous state was changed to the liquid state. So let's relate back to this question. Identify what is the science concept here. Now, since the question is asking about water droplets, and water droplets are actually in the liquid state. So it's asking you how are the water droplets formed? So very likely this is about condensation of water, where the droplets were actually formed uh, through the condensation state. That means first it started from gaseous state and how did it turn into liquid state. Now, if we recall, condensation will only happen when there is warmer water vapor that must come into contact with a cooler surface. There must be a difference in the temperature of the water vapor and the surface that it comes into contact with. Okay, so keep that in mind. That is what we need to remember. That condensation, first of all, is about change of state of water from gaseous state to liquid state. All right, and for that change of state to happen, it must be from a warmer water vapor coming into contact with a cooler surface. Now, with regards to this question, okay, looking at the setup. Now we know that the water is at 70 degrees Celsius. Now that's actually quite warm, and that's typically much warmer than our normal room temperature. Now, our normal room temperature in Singapore context is about 20 or 25 degrees. On a very warm days, it can even be 30 degrees, but it would not reach 70 degrees Celsius. All right. So, which means to say that the water inside the container is a lot warmer than the room temperature outside. All right. So, bearing this in mind, which side of the container has warmer water vapor? Inside or outside? Now, I think the answer is pretty obvious since we know that inside the container, the water is at 70 degrees Celsius, whereas outside, all right, that means surrounding it outside is room temperature. So it will certainly be lower than 70 degrees Celsius. Okay, so come back to the question. Which side of the container has warmer water vapor? And water vapor, we know, is simply surrounding air. All right, it is actually water in the gaseous state, so it's like surrounding air. So it must be that the inside of the container has warmer air, has warmer water vapor, because inside the container there is water at 70 degrees Celsius. Now, knowing that, okay, since we know that warmer water vapor will turn to water droplets, so how is this water vapor inside the container? How does it turn to water droplets? Now, we see a lid on the container. So, the water vapor that is inside the container will rise up and it will come into contact with the inner side of the lid. All right, can you see that? It will rise up. The water vapor will rise up and it will come into contact with the inner side of the container lid. And when it touches the inner side of the container lid, what will happen? There's a change in temperature, right? The warmer water vapor comes into contact with the cooler inner surface of the lid. Can you see the change in the temperature? And so when there is a change in the temperature, what will happen? The warmer water vapor will lose heat. It will lose heat. Condensation is about losing heat. Water vapor lose heat to, to condense into water droplets. All right, so see the picture there. Now, bearing all this in mind, now we know how the warm water vapor inside the container turns into water droplets. Now we still need to come back to answering the question. So putting the answer together, in the way that we answer this question, now recall what the question is about. The question asks, where will the water droplets be observed? Will it be on the inner side of the container or the outer side of the container? All right, so we need to answer that question. So when we put the answer together, we have to answer that. Okay, so in my very first line, I will need to answer that. Okay, so can you see what is written here that is in blue? I mentioned that the water droplets were observed on the inner side of the container. All right, so we have to settle that question and answer to the point. But we need to explain it, right? Explain it. The question asks, explain your answer. Now, when we explain our answer, we definitely need to include science concept. We are answering a science question, so we need to substantiate our answer with science concept. And in this case, it will not be enough to just talk about condensation. Condensation is the main process here. But before that, how did the water vapor came about inside the container? All right, so focus on the inside of the container. We see water at 70 degrees Celsius, but that's water, right? That's liquid state. So how did the water vapor came about? Now there must be the evaporation of the 70 degrees Celsius water. Okay? Evaporation is liquid turned to gas. Okay, so we explained that first liner. Before we go to condensation, we have to explain the evaporation of the water inside the container. Okay, so let's look at our first liner of the explanation. some water in the container evaporate to form water vapor. So that settles it. That first line of our explanation explain how the water vapor inside the container came about. It came about because the water evaporates and then it forms water vapor inside. Now, after that, we have to explain in detail how the warmer water vapor inside the container turns to water droplets. Okay, so that is the condensation process. Now, that requires more detailed explanation because that is the key and that is the focus of this question. All right, now, warmer water vapor inside the container. Now, you have to make it clear in your answer where the water vapor is. It is not from the surrounding outside the container. It is from the inside of the container. Because outside the container, the surroundings also has water vapor, right? So we need to be very precise to know which, all right, where the water vapor comes from. So it is from the inside. Warmer water vapor inside the container. Okay, we know that hot air rises, right? Okay, but be careful not to use the word air. Use the word water vapor. Now, why? Because if we use the word air, now air is a mixture of different types of gases. All right. So air in general is made up of water vapor, it's made up of oxygen, it's made up of carbon dioxide, it's made up of other gases. All right. So just by saying air is not accurate. We have to just be very clear. All right. It is the water vapor. So warmer water vapor inside the container come into contact with the cooler inner surface of the lid. Now see the contrast. All right, condensation will only happen when when the water vapor lose heat. So when it lose heat, it must come into contact with a cooler surface. If the surface is of the same temperature, it will not condense. So there must be a contrast in the temperature. Okay, so that's why we have to use words like warmer water vapor and cooler inner surface of the lid. Okay, so when it comes into contact with the cooler inner surface of the lid, what will happen? The water vapor lose heat. And when water vapor lose heat, the process will then be condensation. All right, so they lose heat and condense into water droplets. So water droplets will then be seen and will be observed on the inner surface of the lid. So that's where in our bare eyes we can actually see the water droplets forming on the underside, all right, the inner surface, the underside of the lid after a while. Now, be very careful. We cannot see water vapor with our bare eyes because it is in the gaseous state. We can't see water vapor, but we know there is water vapor in the surrounding air. But we can see water droplets. All right, water droplets is in the liquid state, so we can see it. All right, so when we put together this answer, now, what are the key things that we need to include? Let's do a summary again. First, answer the question. Okay, how is the water droplets formed? Where is it formed? Okay, inner side of the container. Explain. Now, first, water inside the container evaporate. So it becomes water vapor. Okay. Now the water vapor will rise up and come into contact with the cooler inner surface of the lid. And then it will lose heat and condense into water droplets. So the water droplets will then be observed on the inner surface of the lid. I hope you have a clearer understanding of how to answer this question and how to include and explain your answer using science concept that you have learned. Thank you.